One of the main characters is Stephen Spaulding, the cab driver that Dorothea meets when she first leaves the compound. Stephen is the only character in the book that does have a real-life counterpart. He's based on an incident that happened to me when I was on tour with my first novel, The Song Reader. I was in New York going to tape a television show and talking to the cab driver. This was actually after the taping. Well, I told him, first of all about my first novel because I was excited to be on tour, and I talked a lot, and then I finally thought to say, and you? And ask him about himself. And he told me that he was an immigrant from Romania, that he'd come to New York in the 90s with his family. He lived in Queens, and he loved America. And then, right as we were driving up to my hotel, he said, but since 9/11, I've lost my hope. So we're at my hotel, and I tried to think of what I could say to him, but, he was gone before I could say anything. And he really haunted me. And that incident became the beginning of the novel because I wanted to write about someone who'd lost his hope, and that's Stephen Spaulding, my cab driver. But in my book, 9/11 isn't my story, and I didn't feel like I could tell that, but I did come up with, for me, what would make me lose my hope. And so the book opens with Stephen is in a situation where a year and a half ago, his wife and daughter died in a car accident. So he lost his family, and with that, he decided to turn his back on his career. So he's driving a cab sort of aimlessly now with no reason to believe in the future. I started with Stephen Spaulding, and I got the first chapter. And the end of the first chapter, a girl, and Stephen Spaulding is my hopeless cab driver who broke my heart. I was like, I hope something good happens to him. That's kind of where I start with the book, especially if the character's in very bad shape. But I don't know what it's going to be. And so at the end of chapter 1, a girl gets into his cab, and she's dressed in an odd way, sort of like in a 50s skirt and saddle Oxford shoes, and her hair is strange. And then I didn't know who she was either, and Steve and I are both like, who is this? And the next chapter was this girl, Dorothea, talking about the way she grew up in this odd compound in New Mexico with her father, who is afraid of modern world and afraid of anything happening to his children, which is why he kept them in complete isolation. But as Dorothea told her story, then I found out more about her. Then, I found out eventually another narrator comes in, and I find out what happened to her father in the past that made him so afraid of life in Los Angeles and just afraid of the chance incidents that can happen that can ruin everything, accidents, violence. I mean, he's a very frightened man. Where Charles moved was way up, and that was the part of New Mexico that I really found so fascinating because, I was thinking, who would live there? I mean, obviously there are people that are from there, but I mean, who would immigrate to there from Los Angeles? He would be very, very isolated, and that's what I wanted him to be. It's also the kind of place where there are a lot of people that they might have come from somewhere else, and they might want to be very private. I heard this rumor, and it's only a rumor, so I should be clear about this because I don't want New Mexico to say I'm telling tales, but I heard a rumor that in this one particular town that it was so isolated that if any people, like famous people, wanted to hide any crazy relatives, that they would buy them land out here in the middle of nowhere and just sort of plop them down, and that way the media wouldn't reach them and they wouldn't cause any trouble for their family. And I'm sure that wasn't true. It was the kind of thing that you can say about New Mexico because there's so much space and so much privacy, and it would be a part of America. It's so different than where I am now in Philadelphia. But in New Mexico, it's a part of America where you could hide. You could be there for years, and no one would necessarily find you. It's really wilderness, and you definitely get that wild, wild west feeling when you're out there compared to the East Coast. I mean, you don't see anybody for miles. Sometimes you're driving at night, and there's nothing around but, animals. Like, you'll see blinking eyes of animals. It's a really different world. The inspiration for the family probably came from my family at the time, but just extended, like I was protective of my son, very, not as much as Charles, but I could easily imagine just taking that like 15 steps up. I think that's a lot of what happens with authors. There'll be a little thing that we feel or see, and we extend it, what if, So in this case, my son calls me OP mom for overprotective. So what if OP mom was just much more extreme? And, my husband is also very overprotective, so our son discussed this with us and tried to get us to not be worried so much. And in Charles's case, what happened to him would make this much, much worse. I mean, that would ratchet it up. If you have a little bit of overprotective tendencies, most parents I talk to do. When I was on tour, I met a lot of parents in book clubs and things, and I do think people have a sense that, and whether it's right or wrong statistically, but they have a sense that their children are really unsafe in the modern world and that they don't know how to keep them safe. I mean, they don't really necessarily know their neighbors as well as they used to, and, can they just let their child run down the street, or do they have to drive the child to play dates, that kind of thing. So people are worried about this anyway. We all kind of feel like, it would be nice if we could take our child away from all of these influences and bring them up in sort of this perfect world. So I was taking a feeling I had and a lot of other mothers I knew had, and then just really extending it and say, okay, now we did this, and here are the consequences. And they're obviously not all good. You have to teach your child how to live with the real uncertainty of the world and move around and feel like he or she can be safe by their own ability to judge situations, not keep them from every dangerous situation. The character that was the most difficult voice to find is Dorothea. Dorothea grew up on a compound in New Mexico, and her father, when he took the children away from Los Angeles, and why he did that is a big mystery. It's one of the central mysteries in the book. He left his life behind and ran from everything to take his kids to this sort of wilderness, although it's an upscale wilderness, if you will, because they have every luxury, but they're away from everybody else, and they don't have any contact with town or newspapers or internet or the radio, so they don't know what's going on in the modern world. So Dorothy is basically raised from reading novels. I mean, that's her education, reading old encyclopedias and reading 19th century novels. She's read Jane Eyre like 18 times. So Dorothea certainly doesn't have a modern vocabulary, and a lot of the things that she speaks in a little more formal way, and she also doesn't have any of the common references that we have. So there are things like video stores that Dorothea has to ask what this is. So I had to figure out what Dorothy would know and what she wouldn't know without, sort of overwhelming the plot with, okay, well, every little thing that she doesn't know has to be explained. I had to carefully move around because she is very intelligent and figures things out quickly. She just starts out from a place where she's sort of in the world for the first time. In each case, the character comes to me and just sort of, there they are in the story. They arrive, They, walk in. I don't know who they are. I don't even know their name. And so I have to keep listening to them until they sort of tell me. It sounds so weird, and I really wouldn't have understood it myself until I started writing. But until they tell me a little more about them, I can't force it. I don't outline beforehand and say, okay, I'll have a character like this and a character like that. It doesn't work that way. Somebody just walks to the door. It's like, hello, and hopefully they move the plot forward. I mean, then after the book is written and I know the characters and I've followed their voices, then I do an outline and make sure that everything fits together and, moves things around a bit and just make it coherent. But the initial draft is always very much character-driven, literally. They drive me.